April 1st, 2023. Oh, later to the evening. Let's see here. A bit breezy. Well, what I collected here was a book, and it's from J.E. Cirlot. And it's called A Dictionary of Symbols. And it kind of reminds me of like the dawn of Tantra a little bit, in terms of how when you study something like phenomenology, or the matters of the senses, what is perception, and these kinds of things, how it can arrive that there's the senses we have of the physical senses, and then there's the senses that we have of the mental senses. So the physical senses include sight, touch, taste, hearing, smell, and maybe some vestigial or invisible, senses according to electromagnetic sensation, or the sense of electricity or charge, or perception is what's intromissive and extromissive, visual connection, that kind of thing. And then there's the mental senses, like object sense, essentially, number sense, and the sense of geometry, and the relation of terms, and these usual kind of things, where it's generally established that number sense in humans and infants develops quite early, up to the differences between 1, 3, 5, and a multiplicity. And then there's something like what you would call number sense in animals. It's been ascertained by experiment that there is a certain level of number sense, or that is part of cognition in any kind of thinking being, that it ends up that there's this kind of thing. So this book is a dictionary of symbols, and what it has to do with is essentially over time the interpretation of symbols with respect to their meanings, and what are sometimes cultural meanings, and sometimes are even inherent meanings, like the lizard part of the brain picks up on snakes or something like that. These kinds of things are instinctual vis-a-vis that which is learned. So it's by J.E. Cirlot, translated from the Spanish by Jack Sage, with a foreword by Herbert Reed, from the Philosophical Library of New York. Published in 1962. Translated from the Spanish Diccionario de Símbolos Tradicionales. The foreword reads, in the introduction to this volume, Senor Cirlot shows his wide and learned conception of the subject matter of this dictionary, and the only task left to me is to present the author himself, who has been familiar to me for some years as the leading protagonist of a very vital group of painters and poets in Barcelona. Juan Eduardo Cirlot was born in Barcelona in 1916, and after matriculation from the College of the Jesuits there, studied music. From 1943 onwards, he was active as a poet and published 4 volumes of verse between 1946 and 1953. Meanwhile, the group of painters and poets already mentioned had been formed, Dao Alcet, and Cirlot became its leading theoretician. For historical or political reasons, Spain had been slow to develop a contemporary movement in the arts comparable to those in other European countries. Its greatest artists, Picasso and Miro, had identified themselves with the School of Paris, but now a vigorous and independent School of Barcelona was to emerge, with Antonio Tapiz and Modesto Cuixart as its outstanding representatives. In a series of books and brochures, Cirlot not only presented the individual artists of this group, but also instructed the Spanish public in the history and theoretical foundations of the modern movement as a whole. In the course of this critical activity, Senior Cirlot inevitably became aware of the symbolist ethos, or symbolist ethos, of modern art. A symbolic element is present in all art, insofar as art is subject to psychological interpretation. But insofar as art has evolved in our time away from the representation of an objective reality towards the expression of subjective states of feeling, to that extent has become a wholly symbolic art, and it was perhaps the necessity for a clarification of this function in art which led Senior Cirlot to his profound study of symbolism in all its aspects. The result is a volume which can either be used as a work of reference or simply read for pleasure and instruction. There are many entries in this dictionary, those on architecture, color, cross, graphics, mandala, number, serpent, water, zodiac. I'll give a few examples which can be read as independent essays. But in general, the greatest use of the volume would be for the elucidation of those many symbols which we encounter in the arts and in the history of ideas. Man, it has been said, is a symbolizing animal. It is evident that at no stage in the development of civilization has man been able to dispense with symbols. Science and technology have not freed man from his dependence on symbols. Indeed, it might be argued that they have increased his need for them. In any case, symbology itself is now a science, and this volume is a necessary instrument in its study. Herbert Reed. Edited by Herbert Reed. Or perhaps read, R-E-A-D, Herbert Reed. Introduction from Cirlot. Actuality of the symbol. Delimitation of the symbolic. On entering the realms of symbolism, whether by way of systematized artistic forms or the living dynamic forms of dreams and visions, we have constantly kept in mind the essential need to mark out the field of symbolic action in order to prevent confusion between phenomena which might appear to be identical when they are merely similar or externally related. The temptation to oversubstantiate an argument is one which is difficult to resist. It is necessary to be on one's guard against this danger, even if full compliance with the ideals of scholarship is not always feasible, for we believe with Marius Schneider that there is no such thing as ideas or beliefs, only ideas and beliefs. That it is to say that in the one there is always at least something of the other, quite apart from the fact that, as far as symbolism is concerned, other phenomena of the spiritual kind play an important part. When a critic such as Karl Baroja declares himself against any symbolic interpretation of myth, he doubtless has his reasons for so doing, although one reason may be that nothing approaching a complete evaluation of symbolism has yet appeared. He says, when they seek to convince us that Mars is the symbol of war and Hercules of strength, we can roundly refute them. While this may once have been true for rhetoricians, for idealist philosophers, or for a group of more or less pedantic Greekly, but for those who really believed in ancient deities and heroes, Mars had an objective reality. Even this reality was quite different from that which we are groping for today. Symbolism occurs when natural religions are degenerating. In point of fact, the mere equation of Mars with war and of Hercules with labor has never been characteristic of the symbolist ethos, which always eschews the categorical and restrictive. This comes about through allegory, a mechanical and restricting derivative of the symbol, whereas the symbol proper is a dynamic and polysymbolic reality imbued with emotive and conceptual values, in other words, with true life. However, the above quotation is extremely helpful in enabling us to mark out the limits of the symbolic. If there is, or if there may be, a symbolic function in everything, and communicating tension, nevertheless, this fleeting possession of the being or the object by the symbolic does not wholly transform it into a symbol. The error of symbolist artists and writers has always been precisely this, that they sought to turn the entire sphere of reality into a vehicle for impalpable correspondences, into an obsessive conjunction of analogies, without being aware that the symbolic is opposed to the existential and instrumental, and without realizing that the laws of symbolism hold good only within its own particular sphere. This distinction is one which we would also apply to the Pythagorean thesis that everything is disposed according to numbers, as well as to microbiological theory. Neither the assertion of the Greek philosopher on the one hand, nor the vital pullulation subjected invisibly to the science of weights and measures on the other is false. But all life and all reality cannot be forced to conform with either one theory or the other, simply because of its certitude, for it is certain only within the limits of theory. In the same way, the symbolic is true and active on one plane of reality, but it is almost unthinkable to apply it systematically and consistently on the plane of existence. The consequent skepticism concerning this plane of reality, the magnetic life source of symbols and their concomitants, explains a widespread reluctance to admit symbolical values, but such an attitude is lacking in any scientific justification. Carl Gustav Jung, to whom present-day symbology owes so much, points out in defense of this branch of human thought that, for the modern mind, analogies, even when they are analogies with the most unexpected symbolic meanings, are nothing but self-evident absurdities. This worthy judgment does not, however, in any way alter the fact that such affinities of thought do exist and that they have been playing an important role for centuries. Psychology has a duty to recognize these facts. It should leave it to the profane to denigrate them as absurdities or as obscurantism. Elsewhere, Jung observes that all the energy and interest devoted today by Western man to science and technology were, by ancient man, once dedicated to mythology. and not only his energy and his interest, but also his speculative and theorizing propensities, creating the immeasurable wealth of Hindu, Chinese, and Islamic philosophy, the Kabbalah itself, and the painstaking investigations of alchemy and similar studies. The youth of both ancient and Oriental man possessed a technique of speculative thought which assured them of some success in prophecy, as affirmed by, for example, the archaeologists and historians Continau, who maintains that the schools of soothsayers and magicians of Mesopotamia could not have continued to flourish without a definite proportion of correct prognostications. And again by Gaston Bachelard, posing the question, how could a legend be kept alive and perpetuated if each generation had not intimate reasons for believing in it? The symbolic meaning of a phenomenon helps to explain these intimate reasons, since it links the instrumental with the spiritual, the human with the cosmic, the casual with the causal, disorder with the order, and since it justifies a word like universe, which without these wider implications would be meaningless, a dismembered and chaotic pluralism, and finally because it always points to the transcendental. To revert to the question of limits of the symbolic and to fix more precisely the aims of this work, let us consider how in the facade of a monastery, for example, we may note A, the beauty of the whole, B, the constructional technique, C, its period styling, bearing in mind the geographical and historical implications, D, the implicit or explicit cultural and religious values, etc., and also X, the symbolic meaning of the forms. In this instance, the appreciation of the symbolical implications of an ogival arch beneath a rose window could constitute an item of knowledge different in kind from the other items we have enumerated. To facilitate analyses of this kind without, let us repeat, confusing the symbolic essence of any object, the transitory symbolic function which heightens it at any given moment, with its total significance as a real object in the world. That is our main aim. The fact that a Romanesque cloister corresponds exactly to the concept of temenos, sacred precinct, and to the images of the soul, the fountain and the central fount, like sutratma, silver thread, linking a phenomenon by way of its center to its origin, does not invalidate or even modify the architectural and utilitarian reality of this cloister, and enriches its significance by identifying it with an inner form. So, thus far, Cirlot reminds me somewhat of Home. When we were reading Home, it was along the lines of, he says that the modern scientific dogma of trying to establish a continuum between all things has that we need at least three continuums that are separate. An abstract one and the real one, and then what would link them together as some third thing. So it's in one sense it's kind of an objectivism and an establishment of being objective and what is subjectivity and what is objectivity. Thus, another key thing to figure out is that metaphor essentially eventually fails. The non-logical in the whole realm of what must be the purely logical for our setting, where vis-a-vis these earlier talks that there's been about the pure logic of a theory and how a pure true theory would be real, is that in the sense of that its objects are logical in any one sense, that they're logical in any other given sense, has that it's a form of metaphor. And so metaphor eventually fails in description as from the non-logical objects to these pure objects of thought, these pure objects of reason, these pure objects of abstraction, which altogether are one thing, but then according to Home here and Cirlot here, we have as these separate things, the symbolists and the phenomenologists. This again is as simple as the usual notion that our senses are separate from our mental senses, that our senses of feelings are different from our senses of the mental constructs that augment our physical world, as by a stimulus and response and a store of information, the concreteness, the pebbles on the beach, or the beads on the string, that we use for such manners as calculi, the abacus, the computer, the steering wheel, that instead there's something along the lines of that what's called the metonymy is where metaphor fails, that a metonymy is a mapping of metaphorical objects to real things, even as via mapping of metaphorical objects to logical objects, in so far as they're related or not related, or that they represent abstraction or they represent absurdity. So then with the idea of the strong metonymy is kind of like the idea of the strong platonism. So where Home decides that he wants to have a separate continuum for the Platonist ideals, and again, over time, I see this as kind of just a historical misreading over time of Plato, where the idea of Plato is that things like the sphere are perfect and they exist regardless of our thought. they're objective. They have objective and independent existence. Then the idea that that is a separate realm than our thinking realm is something that instead is brought back together because there is only one universe. There is for monism that all these things are real, so that we can frame together that we can have our phenomenology and our senses and our limited means and our scoped milieu. But that as well, when we have to have a pure theory of pure logic and objects, that results that the theory we're pondering, the theory we have conceived, is via the strong metonymy, 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 that the names of the things, as via the naming of things, and for example, as about the Tetragrammaton or Kabbalah, these are the kinds of things that result then for the Platonist forms that they're in a sense real. And that the circle and sphere, these perfect ideal forms as of Platonism, really are the same things in all that we see, think, and feel about them in terms of how that can be. And that ultimately, fundamentally, the same reality that is the theory establishes kind of why the theory is a reality. And that again, in a deistic sense, in a monotheistic sense, ultimately, then that results as well that it would also be the same thing. Then that our objective and subjective reality and phenomenology is so based on the distance from that we attain to that we attain to ascertain the theory, true and writ large, is truth. And thus is where then when there's discussion here, for example, of symbology and the phenomenology and the literal or the symbolists or what with regards to what was once myth and legend but is perhaps just a historical view of realistic events, or what was once as a matter of faith but that now we have to make apologetics for, as that instead are some sort of accommodation to a system of belief and a coordinated weak metonymy that it still attains to ascertain the same strong metonymy. And so this is among these ways that we can take what are often great divides between people's necessity to have free will, and so they separate Platonism from reality, or they separate their perceptions from reality, or they separate these perceptions from reality from Platonism, and that these kinds of things result a schism of a sort. The chasm, as was brought up in the early talk, or as about Halm and this kind of stuff, about his chasm. That while that is a coping mechanism, that it's certainly fair to say that it will at least, and we do have these differentiations of things, between our abstract thought, between what is objectively as real as our science and shared common phenomenological senses can advise us all, and these other things that result why these are convenient working theories, and to explain how to sort out then, in the sense of any given one there's free will, or in the sense of any given one there's a way forward. There's again that it results for this whole and a holism, a monism, that here, and we can take these readings of these symbolists or Cirlot kind of as an apologetics fundamentally. And the idea that then he continues in this dictionary of symbols to have all kinds of things, kind of like where Jung, it basically looked to dream interpretation as to try to explain the psychological processes of people, and about how the human psychology is based on belief in desires and motivations, or its belief on Maslow's needs, or its belief that we're apes, or its belief that we're animals, or its belief that we're higher order creatures, and that of virtues, and what goes into the notion that our mental models and object models essentially abstract away our animalness up to our humanness. There's that a humanism was that it basically had that animals had some soul or something like that. Then there's this other idea of that humanism in another way would be read again as that humans have rights in a sense, the right to be human, that essentially being all in terms of what would, again, kind of like where Platonism is reread as a strong Platonism that's not just abstract perfect things, objects of reason that are tractable, but somehow the strong metonymy and all things, it's one theory, it's one universe. Is similarly with humanism and for animism and universalism and for theism, that it's the same theory. And so this can be very comforting and very compelling. I find it so because in a lot of ways it sets up a way to answer all the sorts of questions that are existential questions. The question words alone, fundamentally each, as one answer and one thing, and then that all the world of the abstract and the mental, and all the world of the phenomenological and the sensory, again, result a very comforting and compelling reason why the strong metonymy for a pure theory ends up being among reasons why that it gets into why then there's a strong mathematical Platonism, where Platonism has been the dogma for thousands of years for the theory side of things. And we can point to Augustine as being a strong Platonist, 500 years into the Roman Empire or something like that, and not long before its fall. Or most of the thinkers out of the Enlightenment, like Leibniz, the scientific method types, who basically have that science is abstract and its own course and this kind of thing, and free from our senses, and rooted in an empirical that's rooted in an objective of our senses and phenomenology. That Platonism is reworked to be not just, again, another weak metaphor that eventually fails, but a strong metonymy that eventually is a pure theory. And in this manner, it's possible for a philosopher to end up being quite content that he's confirmed and comforted and made that his reason as so follows, his or her, his reason as so follows is fulfilled, and that it's as what was also compelling in what it can follow. So in that sense, I kind of look at Cirlot and Home as of like minds, and rejecting certain strictures otherwise that would involve, for example, blind faith vis-a-vis enduring faith. That of what is argument by authority compared to that which is, for example, here is just argument as authority, or something like that. That it works out that these kinds of approaches then make for then taking all the best from all the prior existing history of philosophy, including stuff like the Dawn of Tantra from Herbert V. Gunther and Chogyam Trungpa, and the Chongzen from the Dalai Lama, and René Descartes' Meditations and Discourses, what we were looking at the other day. And that here for Hom and J.E. Cirlot, that as the front leaf reads here, symbolism was an essential part of the ancient art of the Orient and of the medieval tradition in the West. It is lately revived in the study of the unconscious, both directly in the field of dreams, visions, and psychoanalysis, and indirectly in art and poetry. At the same time, the Gestalt theory of Kohler and Kafka, in pointing out the autonomy of facts and expression and the parallel between the physical and the spiritual, has given renewed significance to the ancient principle of the tabula smaragdina. What is above is what is below. The basic aim of the work is to create a center of general reference for symbological studies by clarifying the unvarying essential meaning of every symbol. The author uses the comparative method, specifying the precise source of information taken from a great number of widely varying fields. What is above is what is below. Now, this reflects on that notion of the dually self-inferent consistency that when talking about why is there something rather than nothing, there was a question of there's four things never to do. Ask what is ahead and what is behind and what is above and what is below. But here it's in terms of some psychology, and we have kind of the conscious and the subconscious, and then there's the usual notion of the id, the ego, and the superego, if I'm not mistaken. The id being as the subconscious, and then the ego, and then the superego. These are usual ways we have analyzed what is, in our number sense, in our object sense, in our thinking sense, how then these higher order senses work out as to why then here he's collected a dictionary of all sorts of symbols, and as over time their cultural influences and the inputs of, besides what the lizardian and mammalian brain makes of snakes, for example, or sunlight and these kinds of sensory stimulations, that then there's as well all kinds of symbols that have to do with, for example, some of the entries from Janus, a Roman deity with two faces. Jerusalem, the celestial. This is celestial Jerusalem, it says. The celestial Jerusalem is usually described as a city in which the mineral element is predominant, whereas the lost paradise is portrayed as a garden which is mostly vegetable in composition. Going on and noting this has posed the question of whether we should say that the vegetation represents the proliferation of the seeds in the sphere of vital assimilation, whereas the minerals represent the results definitively fixed, crystallized, as it were, at the close of a cyclic process of growth. I have similar symbols that I consider when I talk about something like all these objects of pure analysis and thinking and reason. What end up being the objects or elements that are these fundamentally these atoms or the elements that are primary as of the elements of this theory. That what there is are the numbers. That essentially we can think of if numbers are everywhere in the universe, we can kind of think of it as one big number as about a continuum. And so the idea is that eventually, as these numbers get closer to reality, crystallize in a sense, as going on after Cirlot has said that this apparition is, then the idea is you get to what are called metal numbers and concrete numbers. And so then these essentially become the same thing as our real concrete, and what conducts our currents of thought as about from this abstract realm that's Plato's, and our abstract realm that's the absurd. You can entertain any flight of fancy in an abstract sense, and that it need not be not absurd. It's just as simply, though, that you need not worry that the absurd has influence over the real and the concrete. That in this way, in this strong metonymy, it's a way to talk about where the objects, for example, fundamentally are numbers, that it works out that way it's a thing. Jester. The jester is a symbolic inversion of the king. Jewels and gems. Here, you see, these are all various symbols that he's collected. He's got a page or so for each of them. Journey. Journey into hell. Journey of the soul. Judgment, the day of. Juice. Jupiter. Justice. Justice. The eighth enigma of the tarot. This is an allegory of the idea of justice personified as an image rather than that of the empress, depicted full-face and symmetrical. So in this sense, a lot of stuff is what we call the mystical or occult sometimes. And I was reading this other book, and I found this the other day, and it was this box set, and it was the history of all the secret societies of the world. And I found this rather ambitious. I'm like, well, how can you have a history of all the secret societies in the world? And furthermore, why can't I find it on the shelf? And what it is it talks about basically, but a lot of that is like the Freemasons, after the Knights Templar, which is supposedly its source, which is after the mystic accounts of the Egyptians, and then what came out of the Greeks, and the Romans as well. They were animists. The Romans, again, before in this pre-scientific thing, every single thing had basically an analog, but its mechanism was explained as by an animist deity of sorts, or just a name given to a feature or substance or an aspect of their explanatory powers. That anyway, this book then gets into describing all sorts of usual initiation rituals and what goes on in terms of knowledge and membership and this and that, and in terms of the courses that go into the adding on or peeling away layers of perception, and then what is result that there's lessons learned and this kind of thing, or the secret or the knowledge or the wisdom and that kind of thing that is the usual touchstone of all these sorts of cults and secret societies and that kind of stuff. It's mystic and it's an occult. So studying it is a matter of objectively and abstractly that it is as to why this knowledge was carried and carried down. And that it's really as much a study of our academia and our historiography, our history of what is the oral tradition, and particularly in some cases the conditions of academia, or when the only knowledge was carried down in the church, like in the Dark Ages, or when there's an explosion of books after the printing press, or these things that have to do with otherwise the dissemination of ideas, or they're keeping together, or they're making them fragmented, or the need to, there's in terms of the balloon that something has to give when it's squeezed somewhere else. There are these kinds of ideas that add up into the symbology and the methodology that result in today that we have for our pure logic and scientific theory, and the idea that there's enough wealth of scientific detail that it's very difficult to know all of it these days. There's been many points in history where it said there's too much science for any one man to know. There's been the ancient Greeks at some point came up with that. You know, the continental Germans at some point come up with that, where it's like they'll assign some thinker like, well, Descartes knows everything, or Gauss knows everything, or Euler knew everything, and then after that it's like, and now it's too varied to get back to a common course. But this idea of the strong metonymy, and the idea that then we have a pure logic, and it's the same logic, at least for numbers and geometry and sets and parts and wholes and categories and anything that's logical in that sense. And then it works out that it's the same kind of theory, and it can be a phenomenology for our physical senses, and as well our mental senses, which can include the abstract, and that where it makes a strong platonism, then makes for getting around to that this sort of platonism is the same, all the platonism you ever really need to know, as it's always been. It's what monism is when all the question words at least have an answer in being soul. That there's soul definitions, S-O-L-E, soul definitions. Vis-a-vis that human beings have souls, S-O-U-L, soul definitions. That there's a true theory, abstractly, is the same thing in this context, that there is a universe and that we inhabit it, and that anything else does either, because by definition it is so. Es muss sein is something that's sometimes said, and sometimes that's from like the unbearable lightness of being or something like that, but really it goes back to Kant, and it's kind of in Leibniz. Probably more so Leibniz, who in his metonymy, when left to no other thing, said by definition that this is the last thing that is so, and even its negation would be the same thing. That's where we have to get into what Kant talks about in the thing in itself and the noumenon. That when we look at the noumenon, again, it's not like the noumenon, he's like, this is Plato's noumenon, and it doesn't matter what we think because it's not related to concrete reality. And so I'm free to do that here and not have to worry about getting burned at the stake for it or something like that. But for Kant, the idea is that then that as well is inverse, and it has to be this dually self-infraconsistent. Kind of like the reading from the dictionary of symbols here, there is Janus. And so Janus is the two-faced guy on a coin. And so the idea was that he looks one way and he looks the other. He has faces on both sides of his head. He has eyes on the back of his head, and they're his own eyes. And so the idea is he looks either way, and then whether he has introspection. Thus, that in introspection, he can not only cogitate his senses, but confirm them with his added objectivity. And so that's the same kind of thing here with Kant's noumenon and Plato's theory of ideals, that it results as a Leibniz's metonymy. That's a pure monadology. And if it's negated or simply not so, the same thing results. That's this dually self-inferent consistency, that it's the null and void, or universal and whole, or universal and void, the null axiom theory, the null axiom geometry theory, the null axiom number theory, and da. This is a way then to get back around to that. Well, you may not be able to know all of science, but at least it's possible to get started with philosophy and an outlook for mathematics and science and logic that is suitable for all purposes and abstractly objective and of the highest order and highest caliber. So in this manner, it is possible to get to how somebody can really know all they need to know, vis-a-vis then learning the contents of all sorts works, what result a specialization in detail to be good enough at something as to be an expert in it or a consultant. Well, then, have a great day. Now it's the sun is set here, and so it's all right here, weather-wise. And then I wish you well. Spring is upon us, and carrying on some more later. So long.